He walked in with nothing but a gentle smile and a walking stick, yet they saw a thief, not a father. What they didn't see coming was the billionaire son who would own the very bank that humiliated him. He wasn't in a rush. His steps were slow but certain, every movement measured with dignity. The door of the bank opened with a quiet chime, and in walked a man who had lived through more history than most of the staff had ever read. His suit, though modest, was pressed with care. His shoes had been shined that morning, not because he had anyone to impress, but because he believed in self-respect. His hands, wrinkled with decades of labor, gently clutched an old leather wallet and a folded check. The silence that followed was subtle, but it cut deep. A few glances darted his way. A manager's conversation halted mid-sentence. A young teller whispered something behind the glass partition, and a chuckle followed. But he ignored it. He wasn't there for attention. He simply wanted to deposit a check, a small sum, but enough to cover the bills for the month and maybe a small gift for his grandchildren. He took his place in the line, waiting patiently. The line moved, and he moved with it. When his turn came, he smiled softly and stepped up to the counter. The teller didn't smile back. Her eyes scanned him like a scanner searching for faults. The moment he pulled out the check, she leaned back. "Where did you get this?" she asked sharply. No greeting, no warmth, just accusation dressed as a question. He looked at the check, then back at her. "My pension," he answered kindly. "I just need to deposit it into my account." She didn't move. Instead, she reached for a red phone beside her. Her voice dropped into a whisper. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. The elderly man stood silently, confusion starting to settle in. "You're not listed on this account," she said finally, her voice louder now, drawing attention. "And this check looks suspicious." He blinked. "Ma'am, I've been banking here for over 20 years. She shook her head. "Step aside, please. I'm going to have to call security." The people in the bank began to look. Some pretended not to notice, but their eyes lingered long enough to drink in the drama. A child clutched her mother's hand tighter. A man in a suit adjusted his tie, as if the tension were contagious. The old man remained calm, his voice low. "May I speak to the branch manager, please?" The teller ignored the request. She whispered into the red phone again. Moments later, 2 security guards emerged from a side room. They weren't subtle. They came with straight backs and blank stares, like men trained to see a threat where none existed. "Sir," one of them said, "we're going to need you to come with us." The old man didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout about injustice or demand respect. He just looked around one last time, as if searching for a familiar face, someone who might recognize him for more than what he appeared to be. But all he saw were lowered eyes and tightened lips. He was led to a small room at the back of the bank. It smelled of ink and stale coffee. The check was taken from his hand. One of the guards stood by the door. The other began asking questions, his tone clipped and cold. "How did you get this check? Do you have identification? Do you have an appointment?" He answered each question patiently, respectfully. He produced his ID, gave his account number, mentioned his pension fund, but the suspicion didn't fade. "Can you call my son?" he asked eventually. "He'll explain everything." The guard scoffed. "And what does your son do?" "He's in technology," he said simply. Another chuckle, another exchange of glances between the teller and the manager outside the glass door. Their smirks carried the same message. "Old man, just stop pretending." Minutes passed. The humiliation grew heavier with every tick of the clock. He sat quietly, fingers resting on the wooden table, the check now bent at the corner from being handled so roughly. The pride he had walked in with now sat beside him like a bruised child. He wasn't angry. He was just disappointed, not because they judged him, but because this was not the first time, and he feared it wouldn't be the last. Outside the room, whispers grew louder. Phones buzzed. Heads turned. Something was happening. But inside, the old man just sat still, unaware that the judgmental glances, the whispered suspicions, and the disrespect were about to meet a reckoning far greater than they could ever imagine. Because the man they had dismissed as a liar was about to be known as the father of the man who owned everything they thought they controlled. The air inside the bank grew thick with tension. A routine transaction had spiraled into something colder, heavier. Words, though few, carried the sharpness of suspicion. The check, resting on the teller's desk just minutes ago, now lay in the hands of a man from internal security, being scrutinized like evidence in a crime. People whispered, their eyes darting toward the elderly man who sat in silence. The branch manager approached, clipboard in hand and a forced calm in his voice. "We have concerns regarding this check," he said, not asking but declaring. He didn't wait for a reply before flipping through a file of protocols. He spoke as if the presence of a black elderly man in a suit too old and shoes too polished couldn't possibly mean anything but trouble. The man had provided his identification, the account number, the pension details. Still, it wasn't enough. The teller insisted there was no match in the system. She claimed the handwriting didn't look right. Her voice rose as if her tone alone could make suspicion a fact. "This isn't your check," she said loudly enough for everyone in the bank to hear. "You're trying to deposit money that doesn't belong to you." Conversations nearby came to a halt. People paused mid-withdrawal. Even the sound of the printer behind the counter seemed to hush. Eyes slowly turned. Faces leaned. The old man looked around and saw more than just interest. He saw judgment written plainly, casually, as if this was the story they expected from someone who looked like him. He opened his mouth to speak, but found that no one was truly listening. Not the teller, not the manager, not the guard standing too close, arms folded with practiced authority. The man tried to explain. He told them again about his pension. He told them he had received this check every month for the past 12 years. It had always come from the same source. It had always been deposited here. But the words didn't matter. Not when they came from him. Another guard entered. A third employee walked over to whisper something into the manager's ear. Their eyes didn't leave the man's face. They had already decided who he was, what he was doing, and why he couldn't be trusted. "We'll need to contact the authorities," the manager said flatly, as if it was the only option. "Until then, we'll hold the check." The man's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. "Please, just let me call my son." "No," the manager said immediately. "You'll stay here." "But he can explain." "You'll stay. If you make a call, it'll be to the police." The disrespect wasn't just in the words. It was in the tone, the posture, the assumption. He wasn't treated as a man who might be confused or in need of help. He wasn't treated as a valued customer. He was treated like a criminal who hadn't yet been caught. A nearby customer, younger, well-dressed, stepped forward hesitantly. "I think you're making a mistake," she said quietly to the teller. "He's been coming here for years. I've seen him before." But the teller didn't acknowledge her. She kept typing, kept ignoring. The manager turned to the guard. "Take him to the back." The old man stood slowly, adjusting his coat with trembling hands. The shame, so much sharper than fear, wrapped itself around him like a chain. He had done nothing wrong. And yet, in that moment, he was made to feel smaller than he had ever felt before. He was guided past the customers who wouldn't meet his eyes, past the posters on the walls promising community, trust, and personalized banking. Every slogan felt like mockery. He had trusted this place. He had given them his time, his loyalty, his quiet belief that things had changed. But today told a different story. Today told him that no matter how many checks he cashed or how many years he paid his dues, he could still be treated like a stranger at the drop of a doubt. They put him in a holding room. No handcuffs, no raised voices, just silence and paperwork. The kind of silence that says you don't belong here, and the kind of paperwork that implies guilt even when there's none. He sat down and lowered his head. They hadn't asked where the check came from. They hadn't called the pension office. They hadn't cross-checked account records. They just saw a man who didn't fit and assumed the worst. What hurt wasn't the process. It was the assumption, the presumption of guilt, the easy way they dismissed his entire life with a few keystrokes and a glance. He had buried friends. He had worked through 2 recessions. He had raised a family. He had paid taxes longer than most of these employees had been alive. And yet, All it took to erase it all was a single, suspicious look. The clock ticked on. He stared down at his hands and wondered how many more times they'd be forced to prove they were clean. And still, despite the insult, despite the injustice, he held no hatred, just a quiet kind of sorrow. Because what they couldn't see, what they wouldn't even try to understand, was that the man they were trying to break had already built more than they could imagine. And soon, the walls around them would shake with the truth they tried to silence. Outside, the sleek hum of a luxury engine sliced through the air. A black vehicle, polished to a mirror's shine, rolled to a stop right in front of the bank's glass doors. The car didn't just arrive, it announced itself, calm and confident, like it belonged wherever it chose to go. The driver's door opened with quiet authority, and out stepped a man who moved like power wasn't something he reached for. It was something he carried. Sharp suit, no tie, cold eyes that had seen too much and bowed to none. His phone was in one hand, already pressed to his ear, issuing instructions in clipped tones. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. The presence he carried did the work for him. He paused only once, outside the glass doors of the bank, and looked inside. And then, something inside him shifted. The moment his eyes met the figure of the elderly man sitting alone in that back room, head down and dignity bruised, something deep and ancestral roared to life. Years of control, of polish, of corporate calm began to peel away, revealing a fury rooted in love, injustice, and memory. The staff saw him approach but didn't recognize him, not yet. He didn't come here often. He didn't need to. But he knew the bank. He knew the branch. He knew that his father, humble and loyal, still used the same account he opened decades ago, long before his son's first software patent, long before the billion-dollar IPO, long before his face was printed on Forbes. He stepped through the front doors. Time seemed to pause. The clicking keyboard slowed. Conversation stuttered. People turned to look, but didn't quite understand why they felt the sudden need to move aside. The teller at the center of the storm raised her eyes and scoffed under her breath. "Another one?" she muttered. That's when the old man lifted his head. A faint smile broke through the pain in his eyes. Quietly, with pride that refused to die, he whispered, "That's my son." The staff didn't believe it. Not for a moment. The manager chuckled. "Is he now?" He straightened his tie, ready to speak down to another man he assumed was just there to cause trouble. But the words never came, because the moment the son reached the desk, he placed his phone down, looked the manager in the eye, and spoke just 3 words. "Where is he?" The room stiffened. No one answered right away. The manager stammered. The teller blinked. One of the guards, realizing the weight of the man in front of them, instinctively stepped aside. Without waiting for permission, the son walked past them all, through the lobby, past the velvet ropes. He didn't ask questions. He already knew the answers. He had seen the look on his father's face, one he hadn't seen in years. That was enough. He entered the small room and went straight to the man who had raised him with stories of honor, humility, and patience. The man who once worked double shifts to pay for his first computer. The man who taught him never to forget where he came from. He knelt beside him, took his hand, and whispered words only a son can say to a father whose pride has been shattered. Then he stood. The atmosphere in the bank changed instantly. He faced the staff again, and this time they recognized him. Someone gasped. A phone slipped from a hand. A whisper. "That's Jalen Marcus," and with that, the weight of their mistake began to crush the air from their lungs. But it was too late. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need threats. What came next wasn't rage, it was revelation. He walked back to the counter, calmly picked up his phone, and dialed one number. "This is Jalen," he said. "I want the acquisition finalized now. This location. Full ownership. I'm sending the paperwork today. Call legal and make it public." Silence. Stillness. Disbelief. The manager's knees nearly buckled. The teller looked down, her face drained of color. The guards quietly stepped away. "I own this building now," Jalen continued, "and everything that happens in it." The teller tried to speak, but no words came. The apology stuck in her throat, held back by the shame she wasn't ready to face. You see a man walking here with old hands and brown skin, Jalen said, his voice low and unshakable. And your first instinct is theft. Not service. Not respect. Just suspicion. He turned to the crowd. That man is my father, and none of you are worthy to clean his shoes. There was no applause. No music. Just silence, thick and trembling with guilt, because in a matter of minutes, the lie they believed had turned into a legacy they couldn't comprehend. And this was only the beginning of their reckoning. The air had changed. Everything felt heavier, slower, as if time itself had to pause to comprehend what had just happened. Whispers swirled like dust caught in sunlight, delicate but inescapable. The name Jalen Marcus wasn't just circulating. It was sinking, wrapping around every stunned expression in the room. Phones lit up as notifications came in. Headlines were already forming online. Tech billionaire Jalen Marcus buys local bank after father is profiled. Social media erupted like a storm ignited by lightning. Tweets flew. Photos taken moments ago began to trend. And in the middle of it all, the man responsible stood tall, calm, and unapologetic. The branch manager finally found his voice, broken and unsteady. Mr. Marcus, I had no idea. If we had known. He stopped himself. The logic faltered the moment it left his mouth. If they had known the old man had a powerful son, they would have treated him differently. That wasn't an apology. That was an admission of their true failure. Jalen turned his gaze toward him with the precision of a scalpel. That's the problem, he said. You needed to know someone's worth before you gave them respect. The room remained silent, every employee suddenly aware that their futures now hung by a thread, one that Jalen held between two fingers. The acquisition team moved fast. Within hours, contracts were signed, shares transferred, ownership documentation stamped and sealed. Jalen Marcus didn't just make statements, he made decisions. He wasn't looking for a performance of regret. He wanted structural change, and he had the capital to force it. A podium was rolled out near the center of the lobby, cameras flashing all around. Jalen took no pride in theatrics, but today wasn't about him. It was about a lesson that needed to echo far beyond four walls. This building, he began, represents the illusion of equality we've all been sold. He let that sentence breathe, allowing it to wrap itself around the conscience of every person watching, both inside the bank and beyond the screens. You see posters about diversity and respect, but those words mean nothing if the people here don't live them. My father came in with a government-issued check and proper ID, and your first reaction was not to serve, but to suspect. Some staff lowered their heads. Others froze, expressions carved in stone, fear visible behind forced neutrality. My father, Jalen continued, was once turned away from lunch counters. He worked jobs no one else wanted just to put food on our table. He built his life with calloused hands and quiet pride. And yet today, he was treated like a thief in a place that claims to stand for community trust. He paused, then extended his hand toward a young man standing near the back, dressed in business casual, watching nervously. You, Jalen said. You're an intern, right? The young man nodded cautiously. Jalen smiled just slightly. You've got a good reputation. Effective, respectful, observant. Starting today, you're the new assistant branch manager. The crowd stirred. The current manager's eyes widened. What? He whispered. I'm promoting those who see value beyond surface, and replacing those who don't. He gestured toward the teller who had falsely accused his father. You're dismissed, he said flatly. She stammered, stepped back, as if the floor beneath her had turned to ice. Her mouth opened, but no excuse came out. She turned and walked away slowly, the weight of consequences finally catching up. Then, Jalen turned back to the cameras. Let this day serve as a reminder. Status doesn't shield you from judgment, but power can expose it. I didn't buy this bank to get revenge. I bought it to reveal the truth. And the truth is, we still treat people differently when we think no one is watching. He lifted his father's check in one hand. This check was real. This account was real. This man was real. The only thing fake was your belief that you could decide who's worthy and who's not. He placed the check back in his father's hands, the symbolic reversal complete. From now on, he concluded, this branch will operate with dignity, not because I demand it, but because I will ensure it. Cameras flashed. Applause came, tentative at first, then growing louder. Customers stood, not because they were told, but because they felt something shift, something they couldn't quite name, but knew mattered deeply. Jalen didn't smile. He didn't pose. He simply stepped aside and let his father walk forward. And in that single moment, dignity was no longer something to be begged for. It was restored in full, and it stood taller than any balance sheet ever could. The cameras were gone. The headlines had been written. The public outrage had already begun to burn through the digital streets like wildfire. But inside the newly acquired bank, what lingered was something far quieter, far more lasting, an unshakable shift. Jalen stood by his father, the weight of the day slowly dissolving into a strange calm. The old man, once accused, once insulted, now stood tall, not with vengeance in his heart, but with grace in his eyes. He had spent a lifetime enduring things no man should ever have to endure, but not once had he let hatred take root. Even now, when the world finally tilted in his favor, he looked not to punish, but to heal. The branch manager approached cautiously, his pride shattered, remorse written across his every step. He offered no grand apology, just a quiet, sincere look that asked for forgiveness without words. And somehow the father gave it, not because it was deserved, but because bitterness would never restore what prejudice had tried to take. His dignity didn't require someone else's downfall. He had survived worse, and he had learned long ago that forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Justice didn't always mean fury. Sometimes, it meant standing taller than your oppressors by refusing to become like them. The teller, long gone from the building, would become a footnote in a story much larger than her. But her dismissal wasn't the end. It was merely the clearing of space for something better to grow. Jalen got to work immediately, not just rebuilding policy, but rebuilding purpose. He renamed the branch the Marcus Center for Financial Dignity. It wasn't just a bank anymore. It became a hub for opportunity, a place where respect wasn't a luxury but a standard, where no one would ever again be judged for the color of their skin, the wrinkles on their face, or the clothes they wore. The hiring process was transformed, no longer based purely on degrees or scripted interviews. Jalen built a panel of community leaders, social workers, and diversity trainers who could spot character where a resume couldn't. He brought in those who had once been overlooked, retired veterans, single mothers, formerly incarcerated individuals who had proven their redemption. These were people who understood dignity because they had once had it taken from them. Training sessions weren't just about how to open accounts or file documents. They were about empathy, equity, and lived experience. Staff members sat in on community listening circles. They heard real stories, not statistics, not case studies, people. The transformation was swift but sincere. Word spread fast. Customers returned, not just because of curiosity, but because something felt different the moment they walked through the door. They weren't just greeted, they were seen. They weren't just served, they were respected. Jalen installed a scholarship fund in his mother's name for underprivileged youth interested in business. He created mentorship programs, inviting successful entrepreneurs of color to mentor aspiring ones. He opened Saturday financial literacy classes taught by people who didn't speak in jargon, but in stories. He didn't just fix the system. He redefined it. The father watched all of it unfold, quiet and proud. He didn't need to say much. His presence was enough. His story, once a symbol of injustice, had become a seed of transformation. One afternoon, Jalen sat beside him in the community lounge they'd built into the bank's new design. Soft jazz played from overhead speakers. Children laughed in the nearby learning nook. Elderly folks drank free coffee while chatting about home loans and second chances. Jalen looked at his father, eyes filled with something he rarely allowed anyone to see: vulnerability. "You sure you forgive them?" he asked. The old man smiled. "I forgive, son, but I don't forget. That's why what you're doing matters. You didn't just speak for me. You built something for everyone." Jalen nodded slowly. letting the weight of that truth settle in. They didn't want revenge. They wanted restoration. And they had done just that. Justice had arrived, not in anger, but in architecture, in redesigned spaces, rebuilt systems, and rewritten stories. What had begun as humiliation had become legacy. What had been meant to strip dignity had, instead, redefined it. And the name Marcus would never again be associated with shame. It would stand forever as a monument to grace under fire and power wielded with purpose. Not just a story of a father and son, but of a people rising. If this story moved you, imagine how many others still go unheard. Let's be the reason they don't. Like, share, and subscribe to Expect Stories, where every tale carries a truth, and every voice finds power. Your next favorite story is just one click away. Don't miss it.